We have to bring in Bloomberg contributing editor, Harvard University professor Niall Ferguson. Neil, you are a historian. You've looked at China very closely. So put it in context. I mean, we want to talk about the geopolitical risks as well as the economics, but politics right now are signaling something very interesting. Should investors be worried?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I didn't really take too seriously this rumor about a coup, which seemed like complete urban myth. What's actually happening in China is a transition from a very unstable political system, think back to the 1970s as the Cultural Revolution gave way to the Gang of Four, to something that is more orderly. And in fact, there was a piece of good news for investors with the fall of Bo Xilai, the party secretary of Chongqing, who was really an advocate of a more anti-market, almost neo-Maoist style of politics. So his demise is in fact one of the big positives of recent political news out of China.
Yeah, Neil, in fact, Wen Jiabao kind of presaged that by making comments at the National People's Congress saying that China can't accomplish economic reforms without reforming the political system. Does that mean getting rid of people like Bo Xilai and others who might create some instability in the meantime?
Well, I think Bo Xilai was the architect of his own downfall. I mean, his deputy and chief of police was really engaged in a kind of extortion, going around and extracting money out of Chongqing businessmen with threats of anti-corruption investigations. What I think Wen Jiabao is talking about is something more profound, and that's a transition of China from an essentially one-party state without the rule of law to a one-party state with the rule of law. In other words, there'll still only be one party. They're not about to go down the route of multi-party democracy, but they are going to make the party more subject to real legal constraints. If you think back just a few months, the villagers of Wuhan in Guangdong province staged a very successful revolt against corrupt party bosses who were trying to steal their land, and they won that. That was a hugely important signal from the centre that those sorts of practices in the periphery won't be tolerated anymore. So once again, I think that's a market positive for investors. If China becomes a more law-bound society, then foreign investors will be better protected.
Neil, the biggest issues right now, China has to open up its markets to investors. It's undergoing a once-in-a-decade political transition, which it needs to do smoothly, all at the same time when the economy seems to be slowing. How is China going to tackle these enormous challenges?
Well, at the risk of sounding over-optimistic, I think the slowing of the economy was baked into the cake. This is something that the party has been talking about for some time. Remember, they threw a huge amount of monetary stimulus at their economy to ride out the global financial crisis. That was very successful, but one of the side effects was a housing bubble, which they now have under control. Property prices are falling down from their highs. And my sense is that their aim of a 7.5% growth rate is one that they will meet. Yes, that means that exports to China of, say, Australian minerals will be down, but they are still growing. I mean, the likely growth is about 4% this year compared with 11% last year. That's a slowdown which I think the world can handle. All talk of a China crash, of a China implosion, which one occasionally hears of from Western investors, seems to be, to me to be misplaced. Put it this way, China today is economically roughly where South Korea was in 1977 relative to the United States. And South Korea didn't implode. In fact, it kept on growing, and I think that's what China will do.
Yeah, Neil, you mentioned that stimulus. China downgraded its full-year economic growth forecast to 7.5%. Investors have been speculating ever since about the need for stimulus, whether it's from the central bank or whether it's from measures to loosen property curbs. Is there going to be any kind of big change ahead for monetary policy before the change in leadership later on this year?
I think that seems very unlikely unless there's a big surprise from the rest of the world, for example, a full-scale war in the Middle East. My sense is that it's steady as she goes at the People's Bank of China, and the signals coming from Wen Jiabao, the premier, outgoing though he may be, suggest that they feel they now have that property bubble under control. They wanted to bring it down, they wanted to deflate it, but they didn't want to do it too suddenly to avoid a financial crisis, and they seem to have pulled that off.
Now, Neil, every time there's a leadership transition, the West, other nations always hope that China's going to scale back some of its state capitalism, increase the power on the private companies. Is that something that we can count on this time around?
Well, that's not clear. I think that's one of the big uncertainties right now. There are some economists close to outgoing President Hu Jintao who strongly favour more privatisation. One of them once said to me that he wanted to privatise all the state-owned enterprises and the great hall of the people in Beijing. And I wasn't sure if he was joking or if he really meant it. So there are some radicals in Beijing who see the right direction for China to be away from state capitalism and towards the market. And indeed, it may be that in 10 years' time, state capitalism will be mainly a European phenomenon rather than an Asian one.
All right, we thank you so much. Niall Ferguson, Bloomberg contributing editor and Harvard University professor, talking to us about China's political and economic transition.